He slowed the car, told his 69-year-old father to get out, and tossed a warm bottle of water onto the dirt before speeding away under the Arizona sun. No goodbye, no shame. Just the sound of his SUV fading while his father stood in the heat, realizing his own son had just traded love for greed. But that moment of cruelty lit a fire no desert could burn out. What came next wasn't begging, it was justice. Subscribe for more powerful revenge stories, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if your own child left you there? The road stretched endless ahead of them, a ribbon of heat shimmering under the Arizona sun. Inside the car, the air was thick and silent, broken only by the low hum of the tires on asphalt and the soft ping of a message on Ethan's phone. His father sat in the passenger seat, hands folded on his knees, watching the pale landscape roll by. He hadn't said a word since breakfast. The quiet between them had grown heavier with each mile, like the weight of something neither wanted to name. Then, without lowering his voice, Ethan spoke. "We'll need to move quickly once the paperwork's done," he said. His tone was steady, almost bored, like he was reading from a grocery list. "The lawyer said the assets can be transferred into our names within 2 weeks. After that, we can liquidate everything." Liquidate. The word hit like a nail driven into bone. His wife's voice crackled faintly through the speaker light, careless, the sound of someone who'd never gone hungry a day in her life. "Make sure your dad signs whatever he needs to. He trusts you, right?" Ethan gave a short laugh. "Trusts me? He has no idea how bad his memory's gotten. I'll handle it." The old man turned slowly toward the window, afraid that if he spoke his voice might betray the tremor rising inside him. The desert passed in streaks of ochre and dust, but he didn't see it anymore. All he could see was a small boy in a baseball cap gripping his hand at Little League games, asking if they could stop for ice cream on the way home. He could still smell the dirt and sunblock and hear the same voice that now plotted his erasure. His pulse thudded in his ears. Portfolio, power of attorney, transfer. The language of greed spoken in his own car by his own blood. Each syllable stripped away another layer of the illusion he'd built about family loyalty, gratitude. He realized now that his son didn't see him as a father anymore. He was an obstacle, a signature, a loose thread to cut. He gripped the door handle just to feel something solid. "Ethan," he said finally, the name coming out quieter than he intended. His son glanced over half-smiling eyes, still hidden behind dark sunglasses. "Yeah, Dad." He wanted to ask why. Why this coldness? Why this betrayal after a lifetime of sacrifice? But the words tangled in his throat. Instead he said, "I hope you know what you're doing." Ethan's smirk barely moved. "Don't worry about it. It's just business. Business." The same word he'd used when closing on the first house, when negotiating a deal, when explaining why he'd missed every Thanksgiving for the last 5 years. The word that excused everything, even turning on the man who'd given him the world. The father turned back to the window, his jaw tight. The sky outside burned white, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel small. He felt cold. The kind of cold that settles deep inside, clear and deliberate. He had spent years teaching his son the value of patience, of timing, of letting the other side believe they'd already won. Now those lessons were coming home. Ethan kept talking, his voice blending with the engine noise. "We'll sell the lake house first, it's just sitting there. Then the main property. By the time he figures it out, everything'll be done." His father's reflection stared back at him in the window, lined and steady. The man looking out wasn't helpless. He was listening, memorizing, calculating. Every name, every date, every slip of arrogance was a gift. His heart no longer hurt, it sharpened. They stopped briefly at a gas station. Ethan left the engine running and went inside to grab an energy drink. The old man sat still, watching him through the windshield, watching the easy confidence in his son's walk. He thought of the years spent teaching that boy to drive, to build, to plan. He'd handed him blueprints, tools, wisdom, and Ethan had used every one of them to dig a hole big enough for both of them. When Ethan returned, he tossed a bottle of water onto the console. "You should drink something," he said casually. The old man nodded, twisting the cap. His hand was steady now. The anger had cooled into something more dangerous clarity. The rest of the drive passed in fragments. The desert blurred into the city into suburbs, and the suburbs into silence again. The son talked on the phone, laughing softly with his wife, unaware that every careless word was carving his own downfall. "Don't worry, babe," he said. "He'll sign. He always does. The old man's too tired to fight." Too tired. That was what they thought. That age meant weakness, that years of labor and love had dulled the blade. But the truth was, time had only tempered it. He'd built empires before his son ever learned to walk. He knew patience. He knew silence. And he knew how to strike without raising his voice. When they finally turned off the highway toward the mountains, the sun was dipping low, a red coin sinking into the horizon. Ethan adjusted his sunglasses, humming along to the radio, already thinking about money control status. The old man watched the light fade and thought of his late wife, the one person who would have seen this coming. She had warned him once softly. Don't let love blind you to character. He hadn't listened then. He was listening now. A hawk circled above the desert, its shadow gliding across the hood. The father followed it with his eyes, something ancient and steady moving through his chest. The hawk didn't chase. It waited. It watched. It struck when the time was right. He turned back to his son. Ethan was still talking, but the words no longer mattered. The betrayal was complete, and the plan had already begun to form. Every insult, every cold calculation, every dismissive laugh was fuel. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. All he needed was to let the boy believe he'd won. When the car slowed near a lonely stretch of desert road, the father leaned his head against the window, pretending to rest. The reflection of the sun flashed across the glass like a spark of metal. His heartbeat was calm, his breathing even. The moment of realization had come and gone, and in its place was precision. By the time Ethan pulled over and told him to get out, the old man already knew what would happen next. He stepped out quietly, closed the door behind him, and watched the dust rise as the car disappeared into the distance. The silence that followed wasn't defeat, it was strategy. Some betrayals break a man. Others forge him into something unrecognizable. And as the desert wind moved through the emptiness, he smiled faintly because this was no longer his son's story. It was his. The reckoning hadn't begun yet, but it would. And when it did, no one would ever forget it. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he stumbled backward, the blinding sun hitting his face like a spotlight. His suitcase landed beside him, rolling once before collapsing in the dirt. The car door slammed, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Ethan didn't look back. He shifted the SUV into gear, his sunglasses catching a brief glint of sunlight, and then he was gone, tires spitting dust, the roar of the engine swallowed by the desert. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was an echo of something broken, final, irreparable. He stood there motionless, the wind tugging at his shirt. The heat pressed down like punishment, dry and merciless. His throat burned. He raised his hand against the glare, still half expecting the car to stop, for the red taillights to blink, for Ethan to step out, laugh, say it was all a mistake. But the road was empty. A flat line stretching into forever. He could still smell the faint tang of gasoline and dust. The ghost of his son's presence hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. He picked up the suitcase. The handle was hot, almost searing. It felt heavier than it had that morning, as if it now carried the full weight of what had just happened. He turned slowly in a circle, searching the horizon. There was nothing. No cars, no houses, no sound except the wind whistling across the desert plain. A lone saguaro cactus stood a few yards away, arms raised like a silent witness. He wanted to scream, but the sound stayed locked in his chest. His feet began to move before his mind caught up. One step, then another. The asphalt shimmered ahead, a mirage of silver heat waves dancing above it. The soles of his shoes burned. The sun had slipped past Mercy hours ago. Sweat crawled down his neck, stinging his eyes, but he kept walking. Each step was a denial of defeat, a refusal to lie down and disappear the way Ethan wanted him to. He had raised that boy, taught him to throw a ball, to fix an engine, to look a man in the eye. And this was his repayment. He reached a rusted mile marker half buried in sand. Its paint had peeled away long ago, leaving only a ghost of numbers. A vulture circled above its shadow, gliding over him slow and deliberate. For a moment he wondered if that was what he had become, something waiting to be picked apart piece by piece until nothing was left. The thought almost made him laugh. Almost. He tightened his grip on the suitcase and kept walking. The memories came without warning, slicing through the heat like shards of glass. Ethan at 12 crying after striking out at a Little League game. Ethan at 16 grinning wide when his first truck roared to life. Ethan at 25 standing at the altar beside the woman who would later whisper poison in his ear. Every image flashed and faded like snapshots, burning in slow motion. He wanted to hate the boy, but hate required too much warmth. What he felt now was colder, heavier. The sun slipped lower, staining the desert gold and red. The world around him turned cinematic, the kind of beauty that mocked suffering. He reached the crest of a small hill and saw a faint glimmer in the distance, the shape of a gas station, its sign half flickering in the haze. He kept moving, his breath shallow, his vision tunneling. Each step was a negotiation between pain and will. By the time he reached the gas station, his legs trembled. A dusty pickup sat parked near the pumps, its driver nowhere in sight. Inside, the place smelled of oil, stale coffee, and dust. The clerk looked up, a teenager with acne scars and a trucker cap pulled low. The old man reached into his pocket out of habit, only to realize his wallet was gone. Ethan had taken it. The humiliation burned hotter than the sun ever could. "Need some water?" the clerk asked, eyes narrowing with suspicion. He nodded, voice too dry to answer. The kid handed him a plastic bottle, condensation rolling down its sides like mercy itself. He drank slowly, each gulp pulling him back toward reality. When he finished, he pulled a small silver ring from his pocket, his wedding band, and placed it on the counter. "For the water," he said. The boy looked at it, then at him, and something flickered in his eyes. Pity maybe, or fear. He nodded silently. He stepped outside again. The sun had dropped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised and glowing. The first stars began to appear faint and trembling. He set his suitcase down beside the bench and sat. The air cooled quickly, carrying the smell of gasoline and sagebrush. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound echoed across the emptiness, lonely and proud. He stared at the horizon, the thin line where the earth met the fading light. Somewhere out there, his son was probably laughing, sipping wine, convinced he'd buried his father in the desert like an inconvenience. He could almost hear Ethan's voice, slick and certain, bragging to his wife about how easy it had been. The thought should have broken him. Instead, it steadied him, because for the first time he saw his son clearly, not as the boy he'd raised, but as the man he'd created. And what a dangerous mistake that had been. He stayed there until the neon lights from the gas station flickered off, leaving him wrapped in darkness. The desert was quiet now, still and vast. He unzipped the suitcase and took inventory: a few shirts, a shaving kit, an envelope of old photos, and a small folder of documents. The deeds, the accounts, the keys. Ethan thought he'd taken everything, but he'd taken the wrong things. The real power wasn't in what you owned. It was in what you knew. He folded the papers carefully, tucked them back inside, and zipped the case shut. His hands no longer shook. The despair that had crushed him hours earlier had transformed into something sharp and deliberate. The boy might have left him to die in the desert, but he'd just handed his father the one thing he'd never expected: freedom. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, he stood again. The suitcase felt lighter now. He turned his back on the empty road facing the direction of home. Somewhere out there, his son believed the story was over. But stories like this don't end with abandonment. They begin there. And when the reckoning came, and it would come, it wouldn't be loud or violent. It would be quiet, methodical, inevitable. He walked into the sunrise, the desert stretching endless before him, every step a promise that the next time Ethan heard an engine roar, it wouldn't be driving away. It would be coming straight for him. The desert stretched endless before him, a vast ocean of dust and light, where silence wasn't absence, it was judgment. He stood still, the morning wind pushing gently against his shirt, the horizon burning gold. The sun rose like an unblinking eye, and for the first time since the car disappeared, he didn't feel lost. He felt awake. The fear that had gripped his chest through the long dark night evaporated with the dew, replaced by something older and stronger. A steadiness that belonged to men who'd built their lives with their own hands. He watched the world come alive around him. A hawk glided overhead effortless. The shadow of its wings cut across the ground, passing over his shoes, his suitcase, the faint tire marks that led toward the life he used to have. The desert had a way of stripping things down to truth. Out here there were no polite lies, no signatures, no false promises, whispered by people who said it's just business. There was only what a man could carry and what he could endure. He took a slow breath and let it fill him. The air was sharp, dry, alive with dust and memory. He wasn't stranded, he was unchained. For months, maybe years, he'd let himself fade into routine, into quiet surrender. He'd handed over decisions, trust, and power to a son who spoke about him like an expense to be managed. But that man, the one who stayed silent while his own blood planned his disappearance, had died somewhere on that road. The one who remained was something else. He began walking again, not toward the highway this time, but deeper into the desert. His shoes sank into soft patches of sand, the crunch of each step measured and deliberate. He had no map, no clear destination, but he didn't need one. Every direction away from that betrayal was a path toward himself. The light shifted as the sun climbed higher, turning the sky from amber to a merciless white. The heat pressed against him like a challenge, daring him to keep going. He did. After an hour, he came across a small abandoned gas station. Its sign faded to the color of old bone. The windows were cracked, a single metal chair rusting on the porch. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was still heavy with dust and oil. Behind the counter sat a radio half buried under a tarp. He turned the knob. Static filled the room, followed by a faint country song, something about broken hearts and new roads. It made him smile. Even forgotten places had voices if you listened long enough. He found a cooler in the corner, its door half open. Inside were a few plastic bottles of water, probably long warm but still sealed. He twisted one open and drank slowly. The liquid tasted metallic but alive. Every swallow reminded him he was still here, still moving, still in control. On a dusty shelf behind him sat a stack of old road maps. He unfolded one, tracing the faded lines with his finger. Tucson, Mesa, Yuma, cities he hadn't seen in years. His finger stopped at a small dot near the southern border, a place he hadn't thought about since his wife was alive. A quiet property they'd bought decades ago as an escape, a promise for later. He remembered her voice when they'd first stood there together. It's where the world ends and peace begins. He folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. That's where he'd go. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sand moved like smoke across the ground. He tied his jacket around his waist and started walking again, his pace steady. The hours blurred together, the desert changing color as the day wore on. He passed the skeleton of a billboard, half swallowed by sand, its message long gone. A tumbleweed rolled across the road, bumping against his leg before continuing on. Everything in this place moved with purpose, even the things that looked lost. By late afternoon, the sky had softened and the heat gave way to a quiet, glowing dusk. He stopped near a ridge overlooking a dry riverbed. From there he could see miles of untouched land, the kind that looked eternal. He sat on a rock and pulled out the envelope from his suitcase. Inside were the last things that tied him to the life he'd left behind. Old photos, some legal documents, a letter his wife had written years ago. The paper had yellowed, but her handwriting was still precise, strong, unmistakably hers. He read it again slowly, her words cutting through the silence like cool water. If you ever find yourself alone, Richard, don't mistake it for being forgotten. It just means you've outgrown the people who never deserved you. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest. She had always known how to see beyond anger, beyond hurt, into the core of what mattered. She would have understood this moment. She would have told him not to chase revenge, but to build something no one could take away again. He stood his knees stiff but steady, and looked out over the land. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was resurrection. He set up camp under a lone mesquite tree, using his jacket as a pillow and the suitcase as a makeshift table. The stars came slowly one by one until the sky was a river of light. The desert night was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones, but he didn't shiver. He watched the constellations shift and thought of Ethan somewhere far away, sleeping easy, certain his father was broken and gone. The thought no longer hurt. It was almost comforting. Let the boy believe he'd won. It made what came next easier. At dawn he was already moving again. The desert stretched wide and endless, the light breaking in long golden lines. Each mile between him and that car felt like a year shed from his shoulders. He wasn't chasing the past anymore. He was reclaiming the future. And when he reached that quiet piece of land by the border, when he stood on the same ground his wife once called peace, he would begin again, not as a father betrayed, but as a man reborn. He tightened his grip on the suitcase and kept walking, the horizon glowing brighter with every step. Somewhere ahead lay a new beginning, but behind him something darker had begun to stir. Because freedom once found doesn't come without consequence, and somewhere his son would soon learn that the man he tried to erase was far from gone. The road shimmered like glass beneath the sun when he first saw the truck, a blur of red cutting through the desert heat. It slowed, brakes hissing, gravel crunching beneath heavy tires. The driver leaned out the window, a weathered face framed by the brim of a sun-faded cap. "You look like hell, friend," he said, voice rough but not unkind. "Need a lift?" The old man hesitated only for a heartbeat before nodding. The door creaked open and the smell of coffee and diesel wrapped around him like an old memory, warm working human. He climbed into the cab, setting his suitcase carefully between his boots. The seat was worn smooth from years of miles, and the faint hum of the engine felt almost like a heartbeat. The driver handed him a thermos without asking questions. "It's strong," he said. "Might bite back a little." The old man took a sip and felt the burn spread down his chest. It wasn't just coffee, it was revival. "Name's Gus," the driver said, shifting gears as the truck roared back onto the highway, heading west. "You..." The old man watched the horizon slide by, sunlight flashing off the chrome mirrors. "West sounds good," he said quietly. Gus nodded, satisfied with that. Some men didn't need explanations. The desert rolled past in slow waves. Every few miles a gust of wind carried sand across the windshield like ghosts moving through glass. Gus kept one hand on the wheel, his fingers thick and scarred, the hands of someone who had worked too long and complained too little. He talked about the road, about his wife back in Amarillo who made pecan pies for truck stops and mailed them to him so he wouldn't forget home. His laughter came easy like gravel tumbling down a hill. The old man listened. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the rhythm of them, the sound of simple decency filling the space where betrayal had lived. Every story Gus told scraped away another layer of bitterness until for the first time since the road he felt almost human again. They stopped at a diner off Highway 60 as the sun started to dip. Neon lights flickered over cracked asphalt and the smell of fried onions and coffee drifted through the air. Inside, a waitress with silver hair and tired eyes called them sweetheart and poured their coffee before they asked. The booths were cracked vinyl, the kind that sighed when you sat down. Over a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Gus talked about the people he'd met over 40 years on the road, the broken, the proud, the lost, the kind. Funny thing, Gus said, cutting his food with slow precision. Family ain't always blood. Sometimes it's just the ones who don't leave you on the side of the damn road. The old man's fork stopped mid-air. He looked up, meeting Gus's eyes. There was no judgment in them, only a quiet knowing. He forced a small smile. You got that right. When they finished, Gus waved off his attempt to pay. You can get the next one, he said. Or not. Doesn't matter. Just keep walking towards something better. They left a few bills on the counter anyway, the old man's wedding ring glinting faintly under the fluorescent light as he did. Back in the truck, night had settled over the desert like velvet. The headlights carved 2 clean lines through the dark. The stars were clearer now, burning sharp and bright. Gus hummed along to a country song on the radio, and the old man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the motion of the truck lull him. He thought of his wife, her soft hum while folding laundry, her laughter echoing through the kitchen. He wondered what she'd think of this strange man beside him, this highway saint, who had pulled him from the edge without asking for a thing. She'd probably smile and say, "There are still good people out there, Richard. You just have to look long enough to find them." When they stopped again near a truck stop outside Prescott, the lot was quiet except for the buzz of the lights and the distant hum of engines idling. Gus pulled the rig to a stop and turned to him. "This is as far as I go tonight," he said. "You got a place in mind?" The old man looked out at the row of trucks lined up like sentinels under the glow of sodium lamps. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I do." Gus reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's a bus station a couple miles east. Folks there can point you anywhere you need to go. And here," he handed him a small keychain shaped like a silver horseshoe. "For luck. Never hurts to have a little." The old man took it, the cool metal pressing into his palm. "Thank you, Gus," he said, voice rough but steady. "For the ride, for everything." Gus shrugged. "Don't thank me. The road brings people together for a reason. You just remember whatever's waiting down that line, face it standing tall." They shook hands, firm and wordless. Then the old man stepped out into the night. The air was cooler now, touched with the faint scent of rain somewhere far off. He watched the red taillights fade until they were just 2 glowing dots, swallowed by the dark. For a long time he stood there, the silver horseshoe dangling from his fingers, reflecting the light of the gas station sign. He didn't feel alone anymore. Not truly. The world had shrunk to something simple. One man's kindness, one long road, one clear direction forward. He had been betrayed by his own blood, but saved by a stranger who didn't owe him a thing. It was a balance that made sense in a way family never had. He started walking toward the bus station. Gus had mentioned the suitcase, once again steady in his grip. The wind carried the faintest hint of rain and diesel, and somewhere deep inside him, something had shifted. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't wild anymore. It was focused, deliberate, patient. He knew now that vengeance didn't always start with fury. Sometimes it began with gratitude, with the simple realization that decency still existed in the world. And when that realization takes root in a man who's been stripped of everything, it grows into something dangerous. As he reached the edge of the road, a semi rolled past its horn, echoing through the night. He raised his hand in silent acknowledgement, the metal horseshoe glinting in the dark. The truck disappeared into the horizon, and he smiled faintly. Because he finally understood even the loneliest roads could lead home, and sometimes the people who saved you were the ones who didn't even know they had. He turned toward the east, where faint lights from the city shimmered against the night sky. Each step forward felt lighter, stronger, inevitable. What waited ahead was no longer survival, it was reckoning. The bus pulled into the station just before dawn, the sky still bruised with the last traces of night. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and exhaust. He stepped off his knees, stiff from the long ride, the suitcase bumping softly against his leg as he walked. The driver gave a nod as the door hissed shut behind him, and for a moment the sound of the engine faded into quiet. There it was again, silence. But this time it wasn't hollow. It was purposeful, filled with thought, with direction. He stood on the edge of the lot looking out toward the east. The city lights blinked faintly miles away, marking the path home, his home. The old brick house he'd built with his wife Margaret 40 years ago. The place where her laughter still echoed in the walls, where every piece of furniture held the shape of her hand. That house had seen their first Christmas together, their last argument, and the birth of the boy who would one day turn it into a battlefield. He tightened his grip on the handle and started walking. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the sky had turned a soft pink. The streets were waking up, delivery trucks humming, sprinklers hissing to life, the faint murmur of morning radio leaking from open windows. It was strange, he thought, how the world went on as if nothing had happened, as if betrayal and loss were just tiny ripples in an ocean that never stopped moving. When his house came into view, he slowed. The red brick facade looked the same as it always had, but something about it felt foreign now, like looking at an old photograph of himself. The shutters were still painted the blue Margaret loved. The rose bush she planted beneath the kitchen window had grown wild, reaching toward the roofline. He stood at the gate for a long moment before pushing it open. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound so familiar it almost made him smile. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The house had been closed too long. He ran his hand along the hallway wall, feeling the coolness of the paint, the tiny grooves of time where life had once left its marks. In the living room, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, catching the dust in golden suspension. Margaret's piano stood against the far wall, silent, a thin layer of dust softening its black finish. He lifted the cover and pressed a single key. The note rang out slightly off tune but alive. He wandered through each room slowly, as though rediscovering the fragments of a forgotten self. The kitchen still held her teacups lined neatly in the cabinet, the faint floral pattern faded but intact. On the fridge, one photo remained, a snapshot of Ethan as a child sitting on his mother's lap, both smiling at something just out of frame. He reached out and touched the corner of it, his fingers trembling. For the first time in days, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he and Margaret had spent countless evenings drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. He poured himself a glass of water, the sound of it echoing too loudly in the stillness. Across from him sat her empty chair. The leather was cracked where her hands used to rest. He closed his eyes and imagined her there again, the way she'd tilt her head when she listened, the soft smile that always came before she disagreed with him. She'd told him once years ago, "Richard, money's easy to lose. What's hard is keeping your goodness when the world tries to take it." That line came back to him now, clear as if she'd whispered it across the table. Ethan hadn't just taken his father's trust. He'd desecrated everything she stood for: honor, decency, respect. The betrayal wasn't about the house or the money. It was about values that had once meant everything and now meant nothing to the son who bore their name. He rose and moved toward the study, the one room Ethan had never cared to enter. Dust had gathered thick on the shelves, but the books stood in their same familiar order. On the desk lay a small wooden box, its hinges tarnished with time. Inside were old letters, some yellowed with age, and a stack of receipts from the years he and Margaret built their life together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Beneath them lay a faded photograph of the two of them standing in front of the house on the day they'd finished painting it. She was barefoot, a smear of white paint across her cheek, laughing at the camera. He had his arm around her shoulders. He stared at that photo until the edges blurred. It wasn't nostalgia that filled him, it was something deeper, more grounded. Sorrow, yes, but also clarity. He finally understood the kind of loss that mattered. It wasn't about wealth or possessions. It was about watching the world they had built together lose its integrity. Ethan's betrayal wasn't a theft of property, it was a theft of meaning. He sat down at the desk, pulling open a drawer. Inside were old ledgers, property documents, and Margaret's will. Her handwriting curled across the page, graceful and deliberate. She had trusted him to protect what they built, And somewhere along the way, he'd let that duty slip, believing love alone could guard it. The clock on the mantel chimed softly. Outside, the world had shifted again. Children's voices carried faintly from the street laughter echoing between the houses. He rose, walking to the window. Across the road, a young couple was tending their garden, their little boy running circles around them. For a moment it was like looking into a reflection of the past. The same small joys, the same fragile peace. He turned away before it could hurt more. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in the bed he and Margaret had shared, staring at the ceiling where moonlight stretched across the plaster. He could almost hear her breathing beside him, the rhythm of it slow and steady. "You can't fix people by forgiving them," she had once said. "You can only show them what real strength looks like." He rose before dawn, unable to stay still. Down in the study, he spread out the papers across the desk, the deeds, the accounts, the legal records Ethan thought he controlled. He studied them in silence, the faint tick of the clock keeping time with his heartbeat. The anger that once burned wild inside him had cooled into focus. There were still things to protect. There were still promises to keep. Outside, the first light of morning crept through the blinds, cutting thin silver lines across the papers. He gathered them into a neat pile, his movements careful, deliberate. The house around him felt different now, not a tomb but a starting point. The quiet no longer suffocated. It steadied him. He stood at the window once more, the world outside waking under the pale light. Somewhere in that vast, unfeeling city, his son was already plotting his next move, unaware that the man he'd tried to erase had returned not to plead but to rebuild. What came next wouldn't be revenge, it would be restoration. And that kind of justice had a way of leaving a mark no wealth could erase. The morning after he returned home, Richard sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee cooling untouched beside him. The house was quiet, but his mind wasn't. Every corner still carried his wife's memory, the soft hum of her voice, the faint scent of the vanilla candles she used to light when storms rolled in. He stared at the stack of papers spread across the table, deed statements, old contracts. They weren't just documents anymore. They were weapons. He reached for the rotary phone that had sat on that same counter for decades. The dial turned slowly beneath his fingers, each number deliberate, patient. When the line clicked and a familiar voice answered, he felt something in his chest shift. "Ben," he said, his voice low, steady. "I need your help. It's time." There was a pause, the sound of a chair scraping on the other end. Ben Carter had been his lawyer, his confidant, his hunting partner since their 20s. He'd been there through every milestone, the business they built, the marriages, the funerals. "Time for what, Richard? Justice," he said. "Quiet justice." Ben didn't laugh, didn't question. "I'll be there in an hour." When Ben arrived, he still looked like the man Richard remembered. Silver hair slicked back, crisp shirt tie loosened just enough to show this wasn't his first war. He stepped inside, took one look at the papers, and nodded. So the boy finally did it. Richard exhaled through his nose. He thinks he did. They spent hours in the study, the blinds half-drawn sunlight cutting sharp lines across the floor. Ben laid out forms, highlighting clauses, drawing arrows, speaking in the careful rhythm of law. "He used your power of attorney against you." "Yes." "He tried to," Richard said. "Then we'll undo it, line by line." Ben's voice was calm, almost surgical, as he explained the process. "Revocations, transfers, trusts." Richard followed each word, his mind clear. This wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense, it was precise mathematical. Ethan had treated him like a transaction, so now he'd dismantle him with the same language the boy thought he mastered. The first move was the revocation of power of attorney. Ben drafted it in silence, his pen scratching against the paper like a scalpel through skin. When Richard signed his name, it felt final, not emotional, just right. The second step was the creation of a trust. One that would pull every property, every account, every legal asset out from under Ethan's reach. "What do you want to call it?" Ben asked. Richard didn't hesitate. "The Margaret Sterling Foundation." Ben's eyes flicked up. For her. For her, Richard said simply, and for everything he tried to bury with her. The paperwork took 3 days. Each morning Richard brewed coffee at dawn, opened the curtains, and watched the sunlight hit the red bricks of the house his wife had loved. The ritual kept him grounded. Each afternoon Ben returned, briefcase in hand, updates ready. The process unfolded with mechanical precision. Notifications sent, accounts frozen, deeds quietly reassigned. Every keystroke, every signature was another piece of the empire Ethan thought he controlled slipping from his grasp. They filed a motion to void the transactions Ethan had attempted through false authorization. The banks complied, polite but firm, their tone shifting once Ben's name appeared in the correspondence. By the end of the week, Richard's finances were sealed tighter than a vault. The boy had nothing left but arrogance and debt. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows of the garden stretched across the window, Ben poured them both a glass of bourbon. "You know, I've spent my whole career cleaning up other people's messes," he said. "Feels good to be part of one that's justified." Richard gave a thin smile. "It's not about punishment," he said. "It's about balance." Ben raised his glass. "To balance, then." The clink of the glasses echoed through the room, soft but certain. Later that night, Richard walked out to the porch. The air smelled of rain and honeysuckle. He sat in his wife's old rocking chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Across the street, porch lights flickered on, one by one, small beacons of ordinary life. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like an exile in his own story. He felt like the author again. When his phone buzzed on the table beside him, he didn't have to look to know who it was. Ethan. The name flashed on the screen, desperate now. He let it ring twice before answering. "Dad." The voice on the other end was tight, defensive. "What's going on with the accounts?" "The bank says they've been frozen. I can't." Richard's voice cut clean through the static. "You can't? What Ethan spend? What isn't yours?" "Dad, listen. There's been a misunderstanding. I was handling things like we agreed." "There was no agreement," Richard said. "Not anymore." A pause. Then softly, "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted. "And I did." For a moment there was only silence on the line. Then Ethan's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake." Richard looked out at the darkening sky. "No, son," he said. "You did." He hung up before the boy could respond. The phone stayed silent after that. Richard leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet settle around him. The night air was cool, and the crickets had begun their steady rhythm again, a song that belonged to the living. He thought of Margaret, of her steady wisdom, of her belief that good men didn't shout, they acted. She would have understood this. She would have smiled, that small, proud smile she reserved for when he did something she'd told him was right all along. The next morning, Ben called. "It's done," he said simply. "Every legal tie between you and your son has been severed. He can't touch a dime." Richard thanked him, then sat for a long while in silence. There was no thrill of victory, no rush of triumph. Just a deep, grounded calm. Revenge had never been his goal. It was something purer, a restoration of dignity. He walked to the study and pulled open the drawer where Margaret's letter still rested. He read it once more, the edges now soft from handling. "If you ever have to choose between peace and pride, choose peace, but make sure they know you could have chosen pride instead." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the sky had cleared, blue and endless. Somewhere out there, Ethan would soon realize that what he'd lost wasn't money. It was the illusion of control. Richard locked the door behind him and stepped into the sunlight. There was one more thing left to do, something not written in any contract or court document. Because justice, no matter how quietly it begins, always finds its way to the doorstep of the guilty. The papers were signed beneath the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, the ink still drying when Richard finally leaned back in his chair. The room smelled faintly of bourbon and leather, the scent of finality. Ben Carter adjusted his glasses, tapping the folder with the back of his pen. "That's the last of it," he said. The Margaret Sterling Memorial Trust is officially established. Every property, every account, every cent, it's all protected. Richard nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the embossed name across the folder. The Margaret Sterling Memorial Trust. It was more than a name. It was resurrection. His wife's legacy had been stolen once by greed and entitlement, but now it had been reforged into something untouchable. Margaret's name, once whispered softly in this house with grief, would now live beyond it. Ben poured them each a drink, his voice low reverent. "You understand, Richard, your son can't contest this. The assets are no longer personal property. They belong to the foundation, and the foundation answers only to its board. And the board," Richard said, a faint smile ghosting across his face, "answers to me." He raised the glass, the amber liquid catching the light like fire. "To Margaret," he said quietly. "To Margaret," Ben echoed, and they drank. The trust wasn't just paperwork. It was an architecture of justice. Within days, Ben's office had begun the transfers, properties, bank accounts, even the vehicles. The family estate, the lake house, the business accounts all funneled into a single entity bearing his wife's name. The irony didn't escape him. The same empire Ethan had tried to strip from him had now become a fortress he could never breach. The mission statement had been Richard's idea. He'd written it himself by hand in the same steady script he'd once used for love letters. It read, "To provide safe housing, education, and legal assistance to women rebuilding their lives after loss or betrayal." Margaret had believed in quiet strength and dignity, even through pain. He could think of no better tribute than to give that strength back to others. He spent hours each evening refining the details, locations, partnerships, long-term goals. It wasn't vengeance anymore. It was creation. Every page filed, every signature notarized was a nail driven into the coffin of his son's arrogance. What had once been Ethan's playground of inheritance had become a refuge for those who'd never had one. The first property transferred was the lake house, the same one Ethan had called theirs now when he took it for his wife's family. Richard oversaw the process himself, driving out there with Ben to meet the local contractor. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, and for a moment he could almost see Margaret there again, standing on the dock waving for him to join her. But the vision faded with the wind, replaced by the faint hammering of workers beginning renovations. The new sign went up 2 weeks later. The Sterling House, transitional housing for women. The letters gleamed gold against white wood, a symbol of rebirth. Inside, the rooms were repainted, the furniture replaced, the air cleared of entitlement and decay. When he walked through it after completion, he could hear laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen. Real laughter, not the hollow kind that once filled the place. He didn't speak, didn't explain who he was. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. Word spread quickly in town. Articles appeared in the local paper about the retired businessman turning his private estate into a charity. Donations began trickling in. Strangers wrote letters, thank yous, blessings, stories of how the foundation's purpose had touched them. He read each one by the fire at night, the words steadying him in a way no revenge ever could. Then came the call he'd been waiting for. Ben's voice was crisp through the receiver. He found out. Richard didn't ask how. He simply said, "When this morning?" He showed up at the office demanding access to your accounts. He brought his wife, tried to make a scene. And I handed him the paperwork. Ben said, a smile in his tone. You'd have enjoyed the look on his face. Richard imagined it, the flash of confusion, the dawning horror, the rage barely contained behind polished charm. The man who thought himself a strategist now discovering he'd been outplayed by the very man he'd underestimated. That evening, the phone rang again. This time it was Ethan himself. Richard let it ring 3 times before picking up. "Dad," his son began, voice taut, trembling under forced composure. "What did you do?" "I fixed." "What you broke," Richard said simply. "You gave it all away. Everything you built. Everything I... It was never yours." Richard interrupted. Not by right. Not by character. There was a silence so sharp it felt like static. Then Ethan said lower, colder. You think this makes you noble. You think she'd want this. Richard's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She'd want peace, he said. And I finally gave it to her. He hung up before Ethan could answer. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, the first storm of the season breaking across the horizon. He opened the back door and stepped onto the porch as the rain began to fall, the scent of wet earth rising thick and clean. Lightning flashed, illuminating the garden where Margaret's roses still bloomed wild. He remembered how she used to prune them carefully, always saying they needed space to breathe to grow. He finally understood. Over the next few weeks, the trust grew beyond anything he'd imagined. Volunteers signed on. A legal aid office joined the mission. One of the women at Sterling House sent him a letter thanking him for giving her a place to start over. She ended it with a line that stopped him cold. Your wife must have been proud of the man who loved her this much. He folded that letter and tucked it into the same drawer that held Margaret's final note. 2 lives, 2 voices, one past, one present, both speaking the same truth. Legacy wasn't built from what you left behind, but from what you gave forward. Late one evening, he sat alone in the study, the house dim except for the warm glow of the desk lamp. The file labeled Sterling Trust. Active lay open before him. He read through the mission statement again, running his hand over the embossed seal. There was no anger left, only a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came from seeing justice dressed not in wrath, but in mercy. He looked toward the window where rain streaked the glass, like the world washing itself clean. Somewhere out there his son was still raging, still convinced that loss equaled defeat. But Richard knew better. The real inheritance wasn't wealth, it was wisdom. And wisdom once earned could never be stolen. He reached for the light switch, pausing for a moment, watching the glow fade across Margaret's framed photograph on the wall. We did it, he whispered. The house fell into darkness, but for Richard it finally felt like dawn. It began with a phone call he didn't answer, then another. By the third one, Richard muted the ringer and let the silence take its place. He didn't need to hear the panic to know what was happening. Somewhere across town, Ethan was watching his illusion crumble one luxury at a time. The decline wasn't dramatic. It was precise, surgical, poetic. Exactly the way Richard intended. At 9:15 that morning, Ethan's black SUV pulled up to a private gas station he'd frequented for years, the kind of place where attendants greeted him by name and never made him swipe a card twice. But this time the screen flashed red, transaction declined. The attendant hesitated, offered to try again. Ethan forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Must be a system error, he said, laughing too loudly. It wasn't. An hour later, his wife tried to order brunch at their favorite downtown restaurant, her favorite, not his. Same result. Card declined. The waiter's polite smile faltered when the payment failed a second time. Do you have another form of payment, sir? He asked. Ethan's hand tightened around the leather wallet, his jaw twitching. Try again, he snapped. The machine beeped cold and final. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. By noon, Ethan was on the phone with the bank voice shaking beneath the surface of control. I don't understand, he said. These accounts have been active for years. My father's signature. The voice on the other end interrupted, professional and detached. Sir, the accounts in question are now under the control of the Margaret Sterling Memorial Trust. Your name is no longer authorized on any of them. He hung up mid-sentence. The air around him felt thinner somehow, the world smaller. He tried the house keys next, driving back to the estate, sweat gathering along his collar despite the chill of the car's air conditioning. The gates loomed ahead, tall and iron black, the kind he'd once boasted about at parties. When he punched in the code, the keypad emitted a soft beep and stayed locked. He tried again, and again. Nothing. From the security booth, a guard stepped out. Not one of the familiar faces he knew, but a new man, tall and expressionless. Can I help you, sir? This is my house, Ethan said, voice cracking. Open the gate. The guard checked a clipboard. According to our records, this property now belongs to the Sterling Trust Foundation. You're not on the approved list. Ethan stared disbelief, turning his voice into a whisper. You're joking. The man's tone didn't change. No, sir. Please step away from the gate. It was a strange thing to watch. Richard thought later how power leaves a man's body. It's not sudden, it drains slowly like air from a tire. It starts with the eyes the moment realization hits. Then the shoulders slump. Then comes the silence, the collapse. Ethan must have felt it there at that gate, standing in the shadow of a house that was no longer his, surrounded by walls built by a man he'd betrayed. Inside that same house, miles away, Richard sat by the fireplace with a cup of black coffee and the morning paper folded neatly in front of him. The sound of the rain tapping against the windows filled the room. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply turned the page. There was no need for words, no calls, no confrontations, no final speeches. The silence was enough. It was the kind of silence that came after a storm, the kind that didn't ask for forgiveness because it had already delivered consequence. Ben stopped by that afternoon, rain dripping from his coat. It's all over the news, he said, dropping a folder onto the table. Your son caused a scene outside the estate. Reporters showed up. You'll see it everywhere by tonight. Richard nodded, eyes still on the fire. Let them talk. He built his stage, he can stand on it. Ben studied him quietly. You really aren't going to call him no? Richard said. I said all I needed to without saying a word. When evening came, Richard switched on the television. The headline scrolled across the screen, Business Heir locked out of family estate after sudden financial transfer. The footage was grainy but clear. Ethan standing in the rain shouting at reporters, his voice cracking, his wife shielding her face as cameras flashed. The man who had once treated his father like a relic now looked small, fragile, exposed. Richard watched only long enough to see the fury fade from his son's eyes and something else take its place. Fear. Then he turned the television off. He poured himself another drink and walked to the window. The storm outside had stopped, leaving the garden glistening beneath the moonlight. The roses his wife had planted years ago stood proud and heavy with water, their petals glowing faintly in the dark. He thought of her then, Margaret, the woman who believed that justice, when served with dignity, could heal even the deepest wound. She had always said people reveal who they are when they lose what they never earned. Tonight her words came back like a prayer. Somewhere across town, Ethan sat in a rented car outside a hotel he couldn't afford, staring at a phone that refused to ring. He had called every contact he knew, every banker, every friend who had once toasted his name, but the answers were all the same. Sorry, there's nothing we can do. He'd built his life on borrowed loyalty, and now the debts were being collected. As he fumbled with the useless key fob in his hand, he thought of his father for the first time, not with anger, but with something colder, recognition. He finally understood what silence meant. It wasn't weakness, it was judgment. Back at the estate, Richard placed his glass down and looked at the portrait hanging above the mantel. It was one of the last photos taken before Margaret passed, a candid shot of her laughing, sunlight on her face. You'd have told me to forgive him, he said softly, but you'd also have told me not to let him forget. The firelight flickered across the frame, catching her smile in the glow. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet. The weight of anger was gone. What remained was peace, not the soft kind that comes from surrender, but the steady, immovable kind that comes after truth has done its work. When he rose to leave the room, he paused by the desk where a single envelope lay, waiting the official notice of the Trust's public announcement. Tomorrow the papers would run the story in full. Margaret's name would be everywhere again, but this time not in grief, in honor. He turned off the lamp, leaving only the fire's faint glow behind him. Outside, thunder rumbled one last time on the horizon, low and distant, like an echo of something finally ending. Richard listened for a moment, then walked upstairs, each step deliberate, unhurried. The storm had passed, and what remained was exactly what he had planned: silence, justice, and a legacy no one could ever steal again. But as he reached the landing, he stopped, his hand resting on the banister. Tomorrow would bring more than headlines. The trust's work was just beginning. And so was his son's reckoning. The winter sun poured through the tall glass windows of the downtown penthouse, its golden light washing over the marble floors and the faint echo of footsteps. Richard walked through the rooms one last time, his reflection trailing across the polished surfaces like a ghost of who he used to be. This had been Ethan's dream once the skyline viewed the imported fixtures, the endless square footage that screamed success. But to Richard it had always been hollow. Empty walls dressed in luxury could never mask the rot that grew beneath pride. Now, months after the fall, the place felt different. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was calm. He could hear the city far below, the hum of engines, the chatter of morning commuters, the pulse of life continuing in steady rhythm. He stood still, taking it all in before turning to the woman beside him. "This key," he said, holding up the small silver piece that glinted in the light, "used to open a door to vanity. Now it'll open one to hope." The shelter director, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm strength, nodded slowly. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "It's a beautiful property. You could sell it, you know." "The proceeds alone." He stopped her with a quiet smile. "It's worth more in the hands of those who need it than in the pocket of someone who's already had too much." She looked at him for a long moment, then took the key. "We'll make it something good," she said softly. "I know you will." When she left, the room felt larger somehow. He walked to the balcony, pushing open the glass doors. The wind rushed in, carrying the faint scent of rain and steel. From that height, the world seemed almost forgiving. He rested his hands on the rail and looked down at the streets below. People moving, fast cars crawling through traffic, lives intersecting for brief seconds before parting again. The city was a living thing, relentless and imperfect, just like the people in it. He thought about everything that had led him here, the betrayal, the silence, the careful dismantling of the empire his son thought he controlled. It wasn't victory he felt now. It was clarity. All his life he had worked to build something lasting, believing wealth was a fortress that could protect his family. But wealth, he had learned, didn't shield you from decay. It only magnified the cracks. True legacy wasn't about possession. It was about purpose. He looked up at the horizon, the morning sun reflecting off the skyscrapers like shards of gold. For the first time in years, he felt light, not the hollow weightlessness of loss, but the quiet lift of understanding. Margaret had always known this truth long before he did. She'd said once, "You can't take the pain out of life, Richard, but you can decide whether it breaks you or builds you." He finally understood what she meant. The penthouse would become the new headquarters for the Margaret Sterling Foundation, a shelter for women rebuilding after betrayal, loss, and hardship. The same walls that once echoed with entitlement would now hold laughter, healing, and second chances. Rooms that had hosted shallow parties would now host counseling sessions and community dinners. It was redemption made tangible, and it carried Margaret's spirit in every beam and brick. As he stood there, the door behind him opened again. Ben's voice drifted through. "I thought I'd find you up here," the lawyer said. He joined Richard at the balcony, his gaze sweeping the city. "Quite a view. You sure you're ready to let it go?" Richard's smile was faint but certain. "I'm not letting it go," he said. "I'm passing it on." Ben nodded slowly, then handed him a small envelope, the last of the paperwork. "The trust owns everything outright now. You're free." That word "free" lingered in the air. For so long it had felt like an impossible concept. Freedom had always seemed tied to wealth, to control. But standing there looking out at the city below, Richard realized freedom had nothing to do with ownership. It was about release from anger, from guilt, from the illusion that power could heal what love had fractured. He placed the envelope on the balcony table and turned back toward the view. The wind lifted his hair, cool and steady. Somewhere below, church bells began to chime the hour, their sound soft but sure. The world was moving forward. So was he. As the bells faded, he whispered a quiet goodbye, not to the penthouse, but to the life that had brought him here. To the father who'd loved too blindly, the husband who'd grieved too long, the man who'd once confused forgiveness with surrender. Those versions of himself had served their purpose. Now they could rest. The next day, the transformation began. Workers arrived to repaint the walls, replace the sleek marble with warm wood, add soft lighting where once there had been cold glass. He visited once during the renovation, standing in a corner as volunteers carried boxes of books, blankets, and supplies through the doors. No one recognized him. He liked it that way. He didn't want thanks. The work spoke for itself. When the shelter finally opened its doors, the sign above the entrance read, "Margaret's Place, a home for renewal." Reporters came. Cameras flashed, articles were written, but Richard stayed in the background watching from across the street. He saw a young mother step inside holding her daughter's hand. Both of them nervous, both of them hopeful. He watched the little girl pause at the threshold and look up at the sign before smiling. That smile was worth more than any applause, any legacy, any fortune he'd ever owned. That evening he returned home, not to the estate, not to the penthouse, but to the modest brick house where it had all begun. He poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey, and sat by the window. The roses outside had bloomed early this year, defying the last chill of winter. He leaned back, the faint sounds of the city drifting through the open window, and let the stillness settle. He didn't think of Ethan anymore, not with anger or regret. Some lessons took longer to learn than others, and some debts were repaid, not in dollars but in understanding. His son would have to find his own reckoning, his own desert to awaken in. Richard had already found his. The city lights flickered on, one by one, as the sun dipped below the horizon. He lifted his glass slightly as though toasting the night itself. "Here's to you, Margaret," he murmured. "You were right about everything." He took a sip, the cool water grounding him in the present. Outside, the world moved on. Cars passing, laughter echoing from distant porches. The rhythm of life steady and unbroken. For the first time in years, Richard didn't need to fix anything. He didn't need to win. He just needed to be. Peace, he realized, wasn't something you chased. It was what waited quietly at the end of truth. Have you ever had to choose between love and self-respect? Some choices cost more than money, but the return is freedom. Share your story below, and don't forget, sometimes the quietest revenge is living well enough that forgiveness becomes power. Subscribe for more tales of wisdom, justice, and the kind of peace that no betrayal can steal. True justice doesn't always arrive with noise or anger. It often comes quietly through dignity and self-respect. Richard's journey reminds us that peace isn't found in revenge, but in rebuilding what was broken with integrity. For many older adults, it's easy to feel dismissed or taken for granted after years of sacrifice. But this story proves that strength doesn't fade with age, it refines. By letting go of bitterness and choosing purpose over pride, we reclaim control of our own legacy. Wealth in the end isn't measured in money or possessions, but in how we use what we've earned to make life better for others. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means freeing ourselves to live fully again without carrying someone else's shame. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories of wisdom, justice, and quiet strength speak to you, subscribe for more reflections that honor the power of experience and the courage of age.